There is something about a person who walks through life without visible fear that unsettles the environment around them. Not because they are loud, aggressive, or seeking confrontation, but because their quiet confidence breaks expectations that others have relied on for a very long time. Many people move through life guided by invisible pressures. They worry about how they will be perceived, how others might react, or what consequences might follow if they speak their truth too boldly. Over time, this collective caution creates an atmosphere where fear quietly becomes the unspoken rule governing behavior. In such environments, people learn to shrink themselves slightly, to soften their opinions, or to adjust their energy so that they do not disturb the emotional balance of those around them. But when someone appears who no longer operates under those rules, the effect can be deeply unsettling. That person moves differently. They speak with clarity. They remain calm in situations where others would normally panic. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they do not seem easily intimidated by criticism, pressure, or attempts to control them. This is the kind of presence that makes certain individuals uncomfortable, not because the fearless person is attacking anyone, but because their energy exposes something hidden in the room. When you carry a no-fear attitude, people who rely on intimidation or manipulation quickly realize that their usual strategies will not work the way they once did. They may have expected you to react emotionally, to defend yourself aggressively, or to shrink under pressure. Instead, they encounter someone who remains steady, thoughtful, and surprisingly unaffected by their attempts to create tension. This unexpected response creates confusion, and that confusion often turns into fascination. They begin watching you more closely, analyzing your reactions, talking about you in conversations where you are not present. What appears on the surface as criticism or hostility can actually be a strange form of obsession, because they cannot easily understand how someone can operate without the fear that controls so many others. And this is where the deeper truth begins to emerge. Your lack of fear is not recklessness or arrogance. It is the result of growth. It comes from lessons learned through challenges that forced you to become stronger. It comes from experiences where fear once existed, but no longer has the same power over you. What they are reacting to is not simply confidence, but the presence of someone who has already walked through storms that taught them they can survive far more than people assume. And when that realization becomes visible, it changes the entire dynamic of the environment around you. Why fearless people make others uncomfortable begins with a truth that most people do not immediately recognize. Because fear in human environments is rarely discussed openly. Instead, it operates quietly beneath the surface of everyday interactions, shaping how people speak, how they behave, and how they relate to one another. In many social systems, fear becomes the invisible currency that maintains order. People fear rejection, so they soften their opinions. People fear conflict, so they suppress their boundaries. People fear losing approval, so they adapt their personality to match what the environment expects from them. Over time, this shared pattern creates a subtle agreement within groups. Everyone will stay within certain emotional limits so that the overall balance of the environment remains predictable. No one speaks too boldly. No one challenges the hidden hierarchy too directly. No one moves with so much independence that the structure of control begins to wobble. This silent agreement is rarely spoken aloud, yet it shapes entire communities, workplaces, families, and social circles. And for a long time, it functions smoothly, because most people unconsciously participate in it. But the moment someone enters the environment carrying a different energy, someone who is not governed by those same fears, the atmosphere begins to shift in ways people cannot easily explain. A fearless person does not necessarily intend to disrupt anything. They may simply be expressing their truth, maintaining their boundaries, and moving through life with a calm confidence that comes from understanding themselves. Yet that very calmness begins to disturb the emotional equilibrium others have become accustomed to. Suddenly, the unspoken rules start to look fragile. The quiet hierarchy begins to feel less stable. The emotional reactions people rely on to measure influence no longer work in the same way. What once felt predictable becomes uncertain. And uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable for those who have built their sense of security on control. This is why fearless individuals often attract attention, even when they are not seeking it. Their presence reveals that the system of fear guiding the environment is not as powerful as many believed. When someone stands calmly in the face of pressure, refuses to shrink under criticism, and continues expressing themselves with clarity, it challenges the assumption that fear must guide behavior. Others begin noticing the difference between living cautiously and living freely. For people who have long relied on fear as a protective strategy, this contrast can feel unsettling. They may not consciously understand why they feel uncomfortable, but the emotional response appears nonetheless. Some react with curiosity, trying to understand how the fearless individual developed such confidence. Others react with resistance, attempting to dismiss or criticize the person who seems immune to the pressures that affect everyone else. And then there are those who react with hostility, because the presence of someone who cannot be easily controlled exposes the limitations of their influence. Fearless behavior acts like a mirror. It reflects back the fears people have been avoiding within themselves. When someone sees another person standing calmly in situations that would normally trigger anxiety, they are forced to confront a difficult question. If that person can do it, why can't I? This question does not always produce inspiration. Sometimes it produces defensiveness. Instead of examining their own fears, individuals may project discomfort outward, labeling the fearless person as arrogant, reckless, or confrontational. These labels help protect the ego from facing its own limitations. By reframing confidence as arrogance, people can maintain the belief that their cautious behavior is still the wiser path. Yet, even as they attempt to rationalize their discomfort, the presence of fearlessness continues influencing the environment. Conversations shift when that person enters the room. People observe how they respond to tension, how they handle criticism, how they maintain their composure when others attempt to provoke them. Each of these moments reinforces the idea that emotional control does not require fear. Over time, this realization begins affecting the psychological dynamics of the group. Those who once relied on intimidation to maintain influence find their methods becoming less effective. If someone cannot be frightened, manipulated, or pressured into submission, then the tools of control lose their power. And when those tools stop working, the individuals who relied on them must confront an unfamiliar experience: powerlessness. This moment often triggers the strongest reactions. Some may attempt to intensify their efforts, pushing harder in hopes that the fearless person will eventually crack under pressure. Others may attempt subtle social tactics, spreading rumors or questioning the person's motives in an attempt to regain psychological advantage. Yet each attempt reveals the same underlying truth. Fearlessness disrupts systems built on emotional control. The person who refuses to operate from fear unintentionally dismantles the structures that once governed the environment. And this dismantling does not occur through confrontation or aggression. It occurs through consistency. Every calm response, every grounded decision, every moment of composure reinforces the idea that fear is not the only way to navigate life. Observers begin noticing this pattern. They see how the fearless individual responds to situations that would normally produce chaos. Instead of reacting impulsively, they remain thoughtful. Instead of escalating conflict, they remain centered. Instead of shrinking under pressure, they continue expressing themselves clearly. These behaviors gradually reshape perceptions. People who once viewed the fearless person with suspicion begin recognizing the strength behind their composure. Meanwhile, those who feel threatened by the change become increasingly uncomfortable. The mirror of fearlessness continues reflecting back the emotional limitations they hoped to keep hidden. In many cases, the discomfort people feel toward fearless individuals has less to do with the fearless person themselves and more to do with the psychological shift their presence creates. When fear is removed from the equation, individuals must confront new possibilities. They must consider that the boundaries they believed were permanent may actually be flexible. They must question whether the roles they have accepted within their environment truly reflect their potential. These realizations can be empowering for some and deeply unsettling for others. Those who are ready for growth may feel inspired by the example of someone who refuses to be controlled by fear. They begin exploring their own capacity for courage and independence. But those who are not ready for such reflection may experience the fearless presence as a threat to the identity they have constructed. For them, maintaining the existing system of fear feels safer than confronting the unknown possibilities beyond it. This tension explains why fearless individuals often experience mixed reactions from their environment. Some people admire them quietly, drawing strength from their example, even if they never express it openly. Others become strangely fixated on them, attempting to analyze or challenge their behavior in hopes of regaining psychological balance. And still, others distance themselves entirely, unable to reconcile the contrast between fear-driven living and fearless authenticity. Yet through all of these reactions, the fearless person continues moving forward with the same steady presence. They are not attempting to intimidate anyone. They are simply living according to a deeper understanding of themselves. Their courage is not about dominance, but about freedom. The freedom to exist without constantly negotiating with fear. And this freedom becomes contagious in ways that cannot be controlled. Even those who initially resisted cannot completely ignore the example it provides. Over time, the environment begins adjusting to the new reality that fear no longer holds the same authority it once did. The quiet system that governed behavior slowly loses its grip. People begin speaking more openly, setting clearer boundaries, and recognizing that emotional strength can exist without aggression. All of this begins with one simple shift: the presence of someone who refuses to let fear dictate their actions. That refusal may seem small at first, but its ripple effect travels farther than anyone expects. Because when fear loses its ability to control one person, it weakens its hold over the entire environment. And in that moment, the uncomfortable tension people once felt around the fearless individual begins transforming into something else entirely: respect for the quiet courage it takes to live without fear. Your calm energy is breaking their psychological control. Gradually reveals another layer of what truly happens when someone develops a fearless presence. Fearlessness is often misunderstood as loud confidence or aggressive defiance. Yet the form of strength that unsettles people the most is much quieter than that. It is the calm, grounded energy of someone who has learned to control their internal reactions, even when external situations attempt to provoke them. In many environments, psychological influence is maintained through subtle emotional triggers. People learn how to pressure others, how to provoke insecurity, how to manipulate guilt, or how to create tension that forces someone into a defensive position. These tactics work because human beings naturally respond emotionally when they feel threatened or judged. When someone reacts with anger, anxiety, or the need to prove themselves, the person applying the pressure gains an invisible form of control over the situation. They can predict the reaction, guide the conversation, and influence how the narrative unfolds. For a long time, this system works smoothly, because most people do not realize how much of their behavior is being guided by emotional triggers rather than conscious choice. But the moment someone begins responding differently, the entire structure of psychological control starts to weaken. This shift often happens when a person reaches a point in their growth where they understand their own emotional patterns. Instead of reacting automatically to every criticism or attempt at manipulation, they pause, observe, and respond intentionally. This change may seem small on the surface, yet it produces an enormous ripple effect within the environment. Suddenly, the usual strategies that once worked effortlessly no longer produce the same results. When someone attempts to provoke anger, the fearless individual remains calm. When someone attempts to shame them into compliance, they respond with clarity rather than guilt. When someone attempts to pressure them into reacting defensively, they simply observe the behavior without absorbing the emotional charge behind it. Each of these moments breaks a link in the chain of psychological control. The person who expected a predictable reaction now encounters something unfamiliar: emotional stability. And emotional stability is extremely difficult to manipulate. This is where confusion begins appearing in the minds of those who once believed they had influence over the situation. They may initially think the calm response is temporary, assuming that if they apply more pressure, the person will eventually react the way they always have. So they try again. They repeat the same behavior with slightly more intensity, expecting the familiar emotional response to return. Yet when the reaction still does not appear, the situation becomes unsettling. The strategy that once worked flawlessly now feels ineffective. This moment of confusion often marks the beginning of obsession. The individual who attempted to manipulate the situation starts paying closer attention. They begin analyzing the fearless person's behavior, trying to understand what changed. Why are they no longer reacting? Why does criticism no longer provoke defensiveness? Why does pressure seem to slide off them instead of breaking their confidence? These questions circulate quietly in the background while the environment continues observing the interaction. From the outside, people may simply notice that the fearless individual appears unusually composed in situations that would normally create tension. But beneath that calm surface, something much deeper is happening. Psychological influence is dissolving. The reason this dissolution is so powerful is because control requires emotional participation from both sides. Manipulation cannot function if the target refuses to enter the emotional dynamic being created. When someone remains calm, they interrupt the emotional rhythm that manipulation depends on. Instead of feeding the tension, they absorb it without reacting. Instead of escalating the conflict, they neutralize it through composure. And over time, this consistent pattern forces others to confront the limits of their influence. In many cases, the individuals who once relied on emotional control do not even realize they were using it. Their behavior may have been learned unconsciously through years of interacting with environments where intimidation, guilt, or subtle pressure were normal ways of maintaining authority. When those methods stop working, they experience a strange sense of instability. The emotional signals they relied on to guide interactions are suddenly absent. Conversations that once felt predictable now feel uncertain. The fearless individual does not follow the script others expect them to follow. Instead, they respond thoughtfully, sometimes with silence, sometimes with calm clarity. but rarely with the emotional volatility that would give others leverage. This unexpected response can create a sense of psychological imbalance in the person attempting to control the interaction. Without emotional reactions to guide them, they lose their reference points. The dynamic they once understood now feels unfamiliar. This is why calm energy can feel more intimidating than aggressive resistance. Aggression still participates in the emotional exchange, meaning the person applying pressure can continue guiding the conflict. But calm stability removes the emotional battlefield entirely. There is nothing to fight against because the fearless individual is not engaging in the same emotional language. They are operating from a different level of awareness, one where reactions are chosen rather than triggered. Observers in the environment often notice this difference, even if they cannot fully explain it. They see one person attempting to provoke or control the situation, while the other remains grounded and unaffected. Over time, this contrast reshapes perceptions. The person who once seemed powerful through intimidation begins appearing unstable or overly reactive. Meanwhile, the person who remains calm begins appearing strong, reliable, and emotionally intelligent. This reversal of perception further weakens the psychological control that once existed. The environment gradually recognizes that influence does not come from the loudest voice or the most aggressive behavior. True influence comes from emotional stability, from the ability to remain centered when others lose their composure. For the fearless individual, this transformation often happens naturally as a result of personal growth. They may not even realize the extent of the shift until others begin reacting differently to their presence. Situations that once escalated quickly now dissolve before becoming conflicts. People who once attempted to provoke arguments may hesitate, sensing that their efforts will not produce the reaction they expect. And those who once believed they could control the narrative begin losing interest when their strategies no longer produce results. What remains is a quiet form of authority, built not on intimidation, but on self-mastery. Self-mastery is the true foundation of fearless energy. It is the ability to understand one's emotions without being ruled by them. It is the discipline to choose responses carefully, rather than reacting impulsively. And it is the awareness that other people's behavior often reflects their own internal struggles, rather than a genuine threat to one's identity. When someone develops this level of emotional awareness, they become extremely difficult to manipulate, because their reactions are no longer predictable in the ways manipulators expect. Instead of reacting automatically, they evaluate situations calmly and respond according to their values rather than their fears. This shift does more than break psychological control. It also changes the emotional atmosphere surrounding the individual. People begin sensing that attempts to provoke drama or tension simply do not work in their presence. The emotional environment becomes calmer, more thoughtful, and less reactive. In this way, fearless energy does not just protect the individual carrying it. It subtly transforms the entire space around them. Conversations become more grounded. Conflicts lose their intensity. And people who once relied on emotional chaos find themselves without the tools they once used to dominate interactions. Ultimately, what appears from the outside as confidence or fearlessness is actually the visible result of inner discipline. The fearless individual has learned that their emotional state is their responsibility, not something to be controlled by the behavior of others. This realization gives them a level of freedom that many people have never experienced. When someone cannot control your reactions, they cannot control your direction. And when that truth becomes visible, the psychological systems that once depended on your fear quietly begin to collapse. The obsession begins. When their strategy stops working, gradually emerges as the natural consequence of everything that happened before. Because when someone realizes that their usual tactics no longer affect you, the emotional dynamic around you begins to change in ways that are both subtle and intense. In the beginning, the individuals who once tried to intimidate, pressure, or psychologically influence you often assume that the situation is temporary. They may believe that you are simply having a moment of confidence, that eventually the old emotional patterns will return and you will react the way you once did. For a while, they continue operating as they always have, repeating familiar behaviors, applying the same pressure, expecting the same reactions. Yet each time they attempt to provoke you and encounter the same calm, steady response, something inside their perception begins to shift. The strategy that once worked effortlessly now seems strangely ineffective. And the more they repeat it, the more obvious the failure becomes. What they expected to be control slowly turns into confusion. And confusion is a powerful psychological trigger, because human beings are deeply uncomfortable when the systems they rely on to understand people stop functioning properly. This is where the beginning of obsession quietly appears. At first, it may not look like obsession at all. It may appear as curiosity, as criticism, or as attempts to analyze your behavior. People who once ignored you may suddenly start watching you more closely. They observe how you respond in conversations, how you handle conflict, how you maintain composure when someone challenges you. They begin trying to understand what has changed. Why are you no longer reacting the same way? Why does their presence no longer intimidate you? Why does pressure that once created tension now seem to pass through you without leaving a mark? These questions may not be spoken aloud, but they circulate constantly in the background of the environment. The individuals who once expected dominance now find themselves studying the person they once believed they could control. This reversal of attention can feel strange, especially to the fearless individual who is simply continuing to live according to their own growth. From their perspective, nothing dramatic has happened. They are not attempting to challenge anyone or prove anything. They have simply reached a place where they understand themselves more clearly and refuse to surrender their emotional stability to external pressure. Yet for those who relied on influence, this quiet shift feels enormous. Their entire perception of the relationship changes. Where they once saw someone predictable, they now see someone mysterious. Where they once expected emotional reactions, they now see thoughtful restraint. And because they cannot easily explain this transformation, their focus on you begins to intensify. Obsession often begins as an attempt to solve a psychological puzzle. The person trying to regain control wants to understand what happened so they can restore the dynamic they once enjoyed. They may replay conversations in their mind, searching for clues about when your behavior changed. They may talk about you in private discussions with others, asking subtle questions or expressing confusion about your reactions. Sometimes this attention even appears disguised as criticism. They may describe you as distant, arrogant, or emotionally detached. Not because those descriptions are accurate, but because they are trying to rationalize why their usual tactics no longer work. In reality, what they are experiencing is the collapse of a psychological advantage they once believed was permanent. The more they focus on understanding you, the more the obsession grows. What once required no attention now becomes something they think about frequently. They begin noticing small details in your behavior that they previously ignored. How do you remain calm in situations that provoke others? How do you maintain clarity when conversations become tense? How do you continue moving forward as if the pressure surrounding you does not exist? Each of these observations adds another layer to the puzzle they are trying to solve. And the more they try to solve it, the more their attention becomes fixed on you. This is why fearless individuals often find themselves becoming the subject of unexpected fascination. It is not because they are seeking attention, but because their behavior disrupts expectations so deeply that people cannot easily ignore it. What makes this obsession even more powerful is that it often occurs while the fearless individual remains completely focused on their own path. They are not aware of how much attention their calmness is attracting, because their attention is directed toward growth, purpose, and personal clarity. They are not performing strength for others to admire. They are simply living according to a deeper understanding of themselves. Yet this authenticity makes the contrast between them and the people observing them even more visible. The more natural your calmness appears, the more unnatural it feels to those who expected emotional volatility. Observers begin noticing the imbalance between the reactions of different individuals within the environment. When someone attempts to provoke conflict and you remain steady, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The person attempting control may grow more frustrated, while you continue responding with patience and clarity. Over time, this repeated contrast reshapes the narrative surrounding the interaction. People begin recognizing that the obsession directed toward you reveals more about the observer than about you. They see that the person who cannot stop talking about you, analyzing you, or attempting to provoke you is actually revealing their own discomfort with the loss of influence. In many cases, the obsession grows stronger because the fearless individual refuses to engage in the emotional drama that others expect. Without a reaction to feed on, the person seeking control has no closure. Their mind continues circling the unanswered question of why their influence disappeared. This psychological loop keeps their attention locked on you, even when you have already moved forward. It becomes increasingly clear that the energy surrounding the situation has shifted. The person who once held psychological power now appears restless, while the person who once seemed vulnerable now appears stable and self-directed. The environment begins responding to this change as well. Conversations that once focused on criticizing or questioning you begin shifting toward curiosity about how you remain so composed. Some people quietly admire your strength, recognizing that the discipline required to maintain such calmness is not easy to achieve. Others may still feel threatened by the example you represent, but even their resistance cannot erase the fact that something about your presence has changed the dynamics of the environment. What began as a simple refusal to react has evolved into a quiet demonstration of emotional independence. This independence is what ultimately fuels the obsession. People are drawn to what they cannot easily control or understand. When someone displays a level of self-mastery that others have not yet developed, it challenges their assumptions about how relationships and power dynamics are supposed to work. They begin realizing that the influence they once relied on was never as strong as they believed. The person they thought they could manipulate now stands beyond the reach of those tactics. And that realization creates a mixture of emotions that are difficult to process. Some feel frustration, others feel curiosity, and a few may even feel respect for the discipline required to achieve such emotional stability. For the fearless individual, however, the most important realization is that none of this attention needs to change their direction. Obsession from others does not require your participation. It does not demand that you explain your growth or justify your calmness. The strength you developed belongs to you, not to the opinions of those who are still trying to understand it. As long as you remain focused on your own path, the energy surrounding you will continue reshaping the environment in ways that speak louder than any confrontation ever could. The person who once tried to control the narrative now finds themselves reacting to your silence, analyzing your calmness, and questioning their own influence. And in that quiet reversal, the truth becomes visible. The moment someone realizes they cannot control you is often the moment they become the most focused on you. your confidence feels like a threat to their identity. Gradually becomes the next stage of the unfolding dynamic, because once people realize they can no longer control you through fear or emotional pressure, something deeper begins to happen within their perception of themselves. Human beings do not build their identity only through personal achievements or internal values. They also construct it through comparison. Many individuals quietly define who they are by the way they influence others. Some people feel powerful when they can dominate conversations. Others feel secure when they can intimidate someone into silence. And still others maintain their sense of authority by keeping others emotionally dependent on their approval. These patterns are rarely conscious decisions. They develop slowly through years of social interaction, where certain behaviors appear to bring respect, attention, or compliance. Over time, those patterns become part of how people see themselves. They begin believing they are the dominant personality in a room, the one whose voice carries the most influence, the one others hesitate to challenge. For a long time, this self-image remains stable because the environment around them reinforces it. People react the way they expect. Conversations follow predictable hierarchies. Emotional pressure produces the responses they are used to seeing. But the moment someone appears who does not respond according to that familiar script, the foundation of that identity begins to tremble. When you carry a fearless presence, when you remain calm under pressure and refuse to shrink or react impulsively, you unintentionally disrupt the psychological structure that certain individuals have built around themselves. The challenge is not that you are confronting them directly. The challenge is that your behavior contradicts the image they have of their own authority. If they believe they are the person who can intimidate others into silence, what happens when someone refuses to be intimidated? If they believe their criticism can destabilize someone emotionally, what happens when that criticism is met with calm clarity instead of defensiveness? Each time this contradiction appears, it creates a crack in the identity they have constructed. At first, they may attempt to ignore the crack. They may dismiss your confidence as temporary, or interpret your calmness as indifference. But when the pattern continues, when you repeatedly respond with composure instead of fear, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Their mind begins searching for explanations that will protect their sense of self. Sometimes they attempt to frame your behavior as arrogance. If they can convince themselves that your calmness comes from ego rather than inner stability, they can avoid confronting the deeper truth that their influence is not as strong as they once believed. Other times, they may attempt to question your motives, suggesting that you are acting strategically or pretending to be confident in order to manipulate the situation. Yet beneath these interpretations lies a growing awareness that something fundamental has changed in the dynamic between you. The identity they built around controlling the emotional atmosphere of the environment is no longer functioning the way it once did. This realization can feel deeply threatening, because identity is one of the most fragile psychological structures people possess. When someone's self-image is challenged, they often react not with reflection, but with resistance. Instead of asking themselves whether their behavior needs to evolve, they focus on the person who disrupted their perception. You become the symbol of that disruption. Your calmness becomes the reminder that their authority is no longer absolute. And because of this, your presence begins to trigger emotional reactions that appear disproportionate to the situation itself. They may become unusually critical of you, pointing out small details in your behavior as if they are searching for flaws that will restore their sense of superiority. They may attempt to provoke you into reacting emotionally, hoping that one moment of anger or defensiveness will confirm the narrative they prefer to believe. If they can make you appear unstable, they can reassure themselves that their identity as the dominant personality remains intact. Yet the more you maintain your composure, the more obvious the imbalance becomes. Observers within the environment begin noticing that one person appears increasingly agitated while the other remains steady. This contrast slowly reshapes how people interpret the situation. The individual who once seemed powerful through intimidation now appears defensive and reactive, while the person who simply stands calmly in their truth begins to appear quietly confident. This shift in perception further destabilizes the identity of the person who once relied on influence to define themselves. Their authority is not only challenged internally, but also externally. Others begin recognizing that the emotional dominance they once assumed was natural may have been maintained only because people were afraid to challenge it. Your fearless presence exposes that reality without ever needing to confront it directly. This is why confidence can feel threatening to those whose identity depends on controlling others. It removes the emotional leverage they once used to shape the environment around them. Instead of reacting according to their expectations, you respond according to your own internal clarity. And that clarity becomes something they cannot easily manipulate or redefine. Over time, this dynamic forces a decision upon the person whose identity feels threatened. Some individuals eventually choose growth. They recognize that their discomfort arises from the need to redefine how they see themselves. Instead of relying on intimidation or emotional control to maintain authority, they begin developing a deeper form of confidence rooted in self-awareness. For these individuals, your presence becomes a catalyst for personal evolution. They may never openly acknowledge the influence you had on their transformation, but internally, they recognize that your example forced them to confront aspects of themselves they had previously avoided. However, not everyone chooses that path. Some individuals remain deeply attached to the identity they built through control and comparison. For them, accepting that your confidence challenges their authority feels too threatening to their sense of self. Instead of evolving, they intensify their resistance. They may become more critical, more confrontational, or more focused on undermining your credibility. Yet even in this resistance, the underlying truth remains visible. Your presence has disrupted the psychological structure they relied on to feel secure. The more they attempt to restore that structure, the more clearly others can see the difference between genuine confidence and defensive behavior. Meanwhile, your own growth continues quietly. The strength you carry is not dependent on defeating anyone or proving yourself superior. It comes from the understanding that your identity is not defined by how others react to you. When someone feels threatened by your confidence, that reaction reflects their internal struggle rather than any flaw in your character. This awareness allows you to remain compassionate without surrendering your boundaries. You do not need to shrink in order to make others comfortable with their insecurities. Nor do you need to escalate conflict in order to defend your presence. Instead, you continue moving forward with the same calm clarity that disrupted the environment in the first place. And as time passes, the influence of that calm clarity becomes increasingly visible. The environment adapts to the new dynamic. People begin recognizing that strength does not require dominance, and that confidence does not require intimidation. The individual who once relied on controlling the emotional atmosphere may struggle to maintain the identity they built around that control. But the presence of fearless authenticity gradually reshapes the culture around them. What once felt threatening eventually becomes a new standard for how people interact with one another. All of this begins with a simple but powerful shift. The moment someone refuses to allow fear to dictate their behavior. When that happens, identities built on emotional dominance begin to lose their foundation. And while that loss may feel frightening to those who relied on it, it also creates space for something far healthier to emerge. Relationships and environments shaped by mutual respect rather than silent intimidation. Fearless behavior reveals hidden insecurities. around you gradually becomes visible not through confrontation, but through contrast. Because when someone consistently carries calm courage in situations where fear would normally dominate, the emotional atmosphere around them begins revealing truths that were previously hidden. In many environments, people develop subtle ways of protecting their insecurities. They may project confidence through loud opinions, dismiss others quickly to avoid being challenged, or control conversations so that attention never shifts away from them. These behaviors are not always intentional. Often, they are unconscious strategies people have learned over time to shield themselves from vulnerability. As long as everyone around them follows similar patterns, those insecurities remain safely concealed. But when someone enters the environment with genuine emotional stability, the protective layers people have built around their insecurity start becoming easier to see. The reason this happens is because fearless behavior removes the emotional fog that normally hides those patterns. When people react with anxiety, defensiveness, or fear, it becomes difficult to tell who is truly confident and who is simply reacting louder than others. But when one person remains grounded and composed, the difference between emotional strength and emotional instability becomes much clearer. Suddenly, the environment begins noticing small details that were once ignored. The person who constantly criticizes others begins appearing defensive rather than insightful. The individual who dominates conversations begins appearing insecure rather than confident. The one who relies on intimidation begins appearing anxious rather than powerful. None of these observations require you to expose anyone directly. Your calm presence acts like a light that naturally reveals what was already there. At first, this revelation may be subtle. People may feel a vague sense that something about the atmosphere has changed. Conversations feel slightly different when you are present. The emotional reactions that once controlled discussions begin losing their intensity. When someone attempts to provoke drama and you remain calm, others notice the imbalance. The person creating the tension suddenly appears more agitated, while you appear composed and thoughtful. This contrast quietly shifts how people interpret the interaction. Over time, the difference becomes more obvious. Individuals who once relied on emotional manipulation may start revealing their frustration more openly. Because their usual strategies no longer produce the desired reactions, they may escalate their behavior in subtle ways. Their criticism may become sharper. Their attempts to provoke emotional responses may become more frequent. Yet, instead of restoring their influence, these escalations often have the opposite effect. Observers begin recognizing that the person creating the tension seems unusually focused on you, while you continue responding with the same steady calmness. This repeated pattern reveals something deeper about the situation. It shows that the emotional instability surrounding the conflict is not coming from you, but from the person struggling to maintain control. And as this realization spreads through the environment, the hidden insecurities that once remained protected by social dynamics begin appearing more clearly. One of the most powerful aspects of fearless behavior is that it does not need to expose anyone intentionally. It simply refuses to participate in the emotional games that keep insecurity hidden. When someone attempts to shame you and you respond with clarity instead of guilt, the tactic loses its power. When someone attempts to intimidate you and you respond with composure instead of fear, the intimidation begins looking unnecessary. When someone attempts to provoke conflict and you respond with patience, the aggression becomes easier for others to recognize as insecurity rather than authority. In this way, your fearlessness acts like a mirror held up to the environment. People begin seeing reflections of their own emotional patterns more clearly. Some may recognize their own insecurities and quietly begin working on them. Others may feel uncomfortable with the reflection and attempt to reject it by criticizing the person who revealed it. Both reactions are natural responses to the same psychological process, the exposure of hidden emotional dynamics. What makes this exposure so powerful is that it shifts the balance of perception within the group. In many environments, confidence is often mistaken for loudness or dominance. People assume that the person who speaks most aggressively must be the strongest personality in the room. But when someone demonstrates calm confidence without needing to dominate others, the definition of strength begins changing. Observers start realizing that real confidence does not require constant validation. It does not rely on belittling others or controlling conversations. Instead, it shows itself through stability, patience, and the ability to remain composed under pressure. This realization can be deeply transformative for those watching from the outside. People who once felt intimidated by aggressive personalities begin recognizing that intimidation is often a mask for insecurity. They see that the person who once appeared powerful through emotional pressure now seems unsettled when their tactics fail. Meanwhile, the person who remains calm appears increasingly trustworthy and grounded. Over time, this shift influences how others choose to behave. They become less responsive to manipulation and more responsive to authenticity. The environment gradually adapts to the new standard created by fearless behavior. Of course, this process is not always comfortable for those whose insecurities are being revealed. Some individuals may react strongly when they realize that their emotional strategies are no longer effective. They may attempt to redirect attention away from their behavior by accusing you of causing the tension. They may claim that your calmness is arrogance, or that your boundaries are disrespectful. These accusations often arise from the discomfort of seeing one's own insecurity reflected back through someone else's composure. Yet the more consistently you maintain your emotional stability, the more clearly others can see the difference between grounded confidence and defensive behavior. Observers notice that you are not attacking anyone. You are simply responding thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively. That difference becomes impossible to ignore over time. Meanwhile, your own awareness continues evolving as well. As you observe the reactions around you, you begin understanding that many people's behavior is not actually directed at you personally. Their frustration, criticism, or obsession often reflects their internal struggle with the changes your presence has introduced into the environment. This understanding allows you to maintain compassion without sacrificing your boundaries. You recognize that insecurity can cause people to behave defensively, but you also understand that you are not responsible for managing their emotions. Your responsibility is simply to remain aligned with your own growth. As long as you continue responding with clarity and emotional discipline, the environment will continue revealing the deeper dynamics at play. Over time, this revelation creates a powerful shift in the atmosphere surrounding you. People begin trusting your presence not because you demand respect, but because your behavior consistently demonstrates integrity. They see that you do not rely on fear to influence others. They see that you do not escalate conflicts unnecessarily. Instead, you bring a sense of stability that quietly strengthens the environment itself. And as this recognition spreads, the insecurities that once shaped interactions begin losing their influence. The emotional games that once dominated conversations gradually disappear because they no longer produce the reactions they once did. In their place emerges a new form of interaction based on clarity, accountability, and mutual respect. All of this transformation begins with one simple principle: refusing to allow fear to dictate your behavior. When you live according to that principle, the hidden insecurities that once controlled the environment can no longer remain invisible. They surface naturally, not through confrontation, but through contrast. And in that contrast, people begin seeing the difference between emotional strength and emotional instability more clearly than ever before. The moment they realize you cannot be controlled unfolds quietly but powerfully. Because every dynamic built on intimidation or emotional manipulation eventually reaches a breaking point when it meets someone who refuses to participate in it. In the earlier stages of interaction, those who attempt to influence others through pressure usually believe they still have time to restore the old pattern. They may assume that with enough persistence, enough criticism, or enough attempts to provoke reaction, the person they are targeting will eventually return to the familiar emotional responses that once allowed control to exist. This belief often keeps them repeating the same strategies again and again, even as those strategies begin losing their effectiveness. For a while, they remain convinced that the problem is temporary, that they simply need to try harder or apply more pressure. But over time, a moment arrives that cannot be ignored any longer. It is the moment when they finally recognize that their influence over you has truly disappeared. This realization rarely comes through a single dramatic event. Instead, it grows gradually through a series of small observations. They notice that their criticism no longer unsettles you the way it once did. They notice that attempts to provoke emotional reactions are met with calm responses or thoughtful silence. They notice that the tension they try to create dissolves instead of escalating. Each of these moments chips away at the belief that they can still control the dynamic between you. Eventually, the accumulation of these experiences produces a quiet but undeniable conclusion in their mind. You are no longer operating within the emotional boundaries they once imposed. When that realization settles in, the psychological atmosphere changes instantly. The person who once assumed control now finds themselves standing in unfamiliar territory. Without the ability to influence your reactions, they lose the sense of authority they once felt in your presence. And because that authority was often connected to how they understood themselves, the loss can feel deeply unsettling. For some individuals, this moment triggers frustration or anger. They may attempt one final effort to regain influence by intensifying their behavior. Their words may become sharper, their tone more confrontational, their attempts to provoke more obvious. In their mind, this escalation is a last attempt to restore the emotional leverage they once held. Yet if you remain calm and grounded during these moments, their effort reveals the very truth they hope to avoid. Observers begin seeing clearly that the conflict is being driven by someone who cannot accept the loss of control, rather than by the person who simply refuses to be controlled. The more they push, the more visible the imbalance becomes. Meanwhile, your calm presence continues sending the same message without needing to speak it aloud. By refusing to react impulsively, you demonstrate that your emotional state is no longer dependent on their behavior. You show that criticism does not dictate your self-worth, that pressure does not determine your decisions, and that attempts to manipulate the situation cannot override your clarity. This steady response gradually forces the other person to confront a truth they may have resisted for a long time. Influence built on intimidation cannot survive in the presence of someone who has learned to regulate their own emotions. For individuals who built their identity around controlling others, this realization can feel like the ground shifting beneath their feet. The patterns they relied on to guide interactions suddenly stop functioning. Conversations no longer follow the predictable script they once understood. Instead of reacting emotionally, you respond thoughtfully. Instead of defending yourself aggressively, you maintain quiet confidence. These responses leave no emotional hooks for manipulation to latch onto. The person attempting control may feel as though they are speaking into empty space, unable to generate the reactions that once reassured them of their authority. This experience can create a powerful psychological tension within them. On one hand, they may feel compelled to continue trying, hoping that eventually they will break through your composure. On the other hand, they begin sensing that their efforts are only revealing their own instability. Each attempt to provoke you that fails becomes another moment where observers recognize the difference between your calmness and their agitation. Gradually, the realization spreads not only through their own mind, but through the environment around them. The dynamic has permanently changed. You are no longer participating in the emotional hierarchy that once defined the relationship. Instead, you are operating from a position of self-mastery that cannot easily be influenced by external pressure. This is the point where fearlessness transforms from a personal quality into a visible force within the environment. People begin noticing that your presence changes the way interactions unfold. Tension that might have escalated into conflict dissipates when you remain calm. Attempts to provoke drama lose their energy because you refuse to amplify them. Conversations become more thoughtful and measured because the emotional intensity that once dominated them no longer finds fuel. In this way, your independence quietly reshapes the atmosphere around you. You are not forcing others to behave differently, yet your refusal to engage in destructive dynamics encourages a new standard of interaction. Over time, even the person who once attempted to control you may begin recognizing the futility of their efforts. Some may eventually withdraw their attempts altogether, realizing that continuing to provoke you only damages their own credibility. Others may distance themselves emotionally, choosing to avoid situations where they cannot maintain the influence they once enjoyed. And in some rare cases, the realization that they cannot control you may inspire them to examine their own behavior more honestly. They may begin questioning why they felt the need to dominate others in the first place. While not everyone reaches this level of reflection, the possibility always exists once the illusion of control has been broken. For you, however, the most important transformation has already occurred. By the time others recognize they cannot control you, you have already stepped into a deeper understanding of your own autonomy. You have learned that your reactions belong to you alone. No criticism, no intimidation, and no attempt to provoke conflict can override the internal discipline you have developed. This realization becomes one of the most empowering experiences a person can have. It removes the invisible strings that once allowed others to guide your emotional responses. Instead of reacting to every external pressure, you now choose your responses based on clarity and intention. This freedom does not make you indifferent to others, nor does it mean you become emotionally detached. Rather, it allows you to engage with the world from a place of stability instead of fear. You can listen without absorbing negativity. You can respond without escalating conflict. You can maintain compassion while still protecting your boundaries. And because this stability comes from within, it cannot be taken away by someone else's behavior. The moment others realize they cannot control you, therefore becomes more than just a shift in a single relationship. It marks the beginning of a new phase in your personal development. You are no longer navigating the world through the lens of how others might react to you. Instead, you move forward, guided by your own values and understanding. Those who once attempted to intimidate or manipulate you may continue observing from the outside, sometimes with confusion, sometimes with frustration, and occasionally with reluctant respect. But their perception no longer defines your direction. The quiet truth that emerges from this moment is simple yet profound. The greatest form of power is not the ability to control others, but the ability to control yourself. And once you master that internal discipline, the systems that once depended on your fear lose their influence entirely. Your fearlessness is actually the result of hard lessons becomes clear when people begin wondering how someone develops the kind of calm presence that seems impossible to intimidate. From the outside, fearless behavior can appear mysterious, almost as if it is a natural trait that certain people simply possess while others do not. But the truth is far more grounded and far more powerful than that. Fearlessness rarely appears suddenly or without reason. It is almost always the result of experiences that forced a person to confront uncertainty, pressure, and emotional storms long before anyone else noticed the strength forming inside them. The composure people see now is not the absence of struggle. It is the evidence of someone who has already walked through struggles that reshaped their understanding of fear itself. There was a time when situations may have shaken your confidence, when criticism felt heavier, when pressure from others seemed difficult to navigate. But each of those moments quietly taught you something about your own resilience. Every challenge forced you to observe your reactions, to understand your emotions, and eventually to develop the discipline required to remain grounded when the world around you felt chaotic. Over time, those lessons accumulated. The things that once felt overwhelming gradually became manageable. Situations that once triggered anxiety became opportunities to practice patience. And slowly, almost without realizing it, you began building the emotional stability that people now describe as fearless. This is why others often misunderstand the source of your strength. They see the calmness, but they do not see the years of experience that created it. They see your composure during difficult moments, but they do not see the internal growth that allowed you to reach that level of clarity. What they interpret as a no-fear attitude is actually the result of someone who has learned that fear does not have to control their decisions. When you have already faced uncertainty and survived it, when you have already endured criticism and discovered that it did not define you, when you have already navigated situations that tested your patience and character, the power of intimidation begins losing its influence. You recognize that emotional storms eventually pass, that pressure from others does not determine your identity, and that reacting impulsively only gives unnecessary power to the situation. This understanding allows you to move differently. You listen more carefully, respond more thoughtfully, and remain steady even when others attempt to create tension. And ironically, the very lessons that once felt painful become the foundation of the strength people now find so intimidating. The storms you walked through were never meant to break you. They were shaping the discipline that now allows you to stand calmly while others react emotionally. They were teaching you how to navigate conflict without losing your clarity. They were building the internal stability that makes fearlessness possible. When people feel unsettled by your presence, they are often reacting to the quiet confidence that comes from someone who has already faced challenges and grown stronger because of them. They sense that intimidation will not work because you have already learned how to remain grounded during difficult moments. And although they may not understand the journey that created your strength, the energy of that journey is visible in the way you carry yourself. What they call fearless is simply the natural posture of someone who has learned that their peace is more valuable than reacting to every attempt at pressure or control. And as the full picture of this journey comes into focus, what becomes most clear is that the no-fear attitude people are reacting to was never about intimidating anyone or trying to appear stronger than others. It is the quiet result of someone who has simply reached a deeper understanding of themselves. When you step back and observe everything that unfolded, from the moment your calm presence began disrupting emotional control, to the growing obsession from those who could no longer influence you, to the realization that your confidence challenged identities built on intimidation, you begin to see that this entire process was never truly about conflict with other people. It was about the evolution of your own inner stability. Every reaction others had toward your fearlessness revealed something about the emotional structures operating around you. Some people were curious because your composure showed them that another way of living was possible. Others felt threatened because your calm independence removed the emotional leverage they once relied on. And a few became obsessed with understanding you because the loss of influence forced them to question dynamics they had never examined before. Yet through all of these reactions, the most important transformation was happening quietly within you. You were learning that your peace does not need to be negotiated with anyone. You were learning that emotional control is far more powerful than emotional dominance. And perhaps most importantly, you were discovering that when you stop allowing fear to guide your responses, the entire environment around you begins changing in ways that feel almost surreal. Situations that once seemed intimidating lose their power. People who once relied on pressure begin revealing their own instability. Conversations that once revolved around emotional tension begin shifting toward clarity and authenticity. This is not because you are forcing change upon anyone, but because fearless presence naturally dissolves the invisible structures built on fear. The moment someone realizes they cannot intimidate you, manipulate your reactions, or shake your confidence, the entire dynamic transforms. Some people step back, recognizing that their old strategies no longer work. Others begin watching more closely, trying to understand the calm strength they cannot easily influence. But regardless of how others respond, the most important truth remains the same. The power they once held over your emotional state is gone. That freedom changes everything. It allows you to move through life with a sense of clarity that many people spend years searching for. You no longer measure your worth through the reactions of others. You no longer feel the need to prove yourself in every confrontation. Instead, you carry the quiet confidence of someone who understands that their greatest strength lies not in overpowering others, but in mastering themselves. And that mastery creates an energy that people cannot easily ignore. Some will admire it, some will question it, and some may even fear it. But none of those reactions need to alter your path. Because once you understand that your calmness is not weakness, and your fearlessness is not arrogance, you begin walking through the world with a different kind of awareness. You realize that the storms you once faced were never meant to trap you in fear. They were teaching you how to stand steady when others are shaken, how to respond thoughtfully when others react impulsively, and how to carry peace into environments that once depended on tension to maintain control. And in that realization, the story reaches its most powerful conclusion. The reason your fearlessness unsettles some people is because it quietly proves that the control they believed they had over you never truly existed at all.